Hi everyone, welcome back to Different Frames the World. Today we're going to talk about a topic that sounds distant, but is actually really close to ordinary people like you and me. How close is it? Close enough that it affects how much you pay to fill up your gas tank, why the things you buy keep getting more expensive, and why your company's orders sometimes spike or drop. Also, a bigger picture, the direction of China's economy over the next 5 years, and whether global supply chains are about to undergo a massive shakeup. All of that is tied to this issue. And the issue is this: if the 4-year-long Russia-Ukraine war ends now with what you could call a Russian victory or a Russia-led settlement, then on the global chessboard, is China a winner? Or, as Minxin Pei, the Chinese-American scholar, has suggested, could China end up being the biggest loser? You might be thinking, Russia wins, but China loses the most. That sounds weird. China and Russia have been cooperating more and more in recent years. Trade is expanding, energy supply is steady, and gas pipeline construction is accelerating. Everything seems mutually beneficial. If Russia wins, China becomes the biggest loser. How can it be? So today, we're going to break this down systematically. I'll first explain what Minxin Pei is worried about. We'll then look at counterarguments and finally summarize the real risks, what's been exaggerated, what's been overlooked, and the real effects we might feel in our lives over the next few years. Let's start with Professor Minxin Pei. He's a Chinese-American scholar who's been active in international politics and China studies for years. His opinions are widely cited in Western media. If you don't follow Western media, you might not know him, but they reference him almost every day. His view this time is very clear. If Russia wins, it might not be good for China. It could even be bad, really bad. Why? His reasoning isn't the usual political squabble, it's structural. His core argument is this: the benefits China has gained over the past 2 years because of the Russia-Ukraine war are actually abnormal. Simply put, Russia was cut off from Europe's energy and heavily sanctioned, so it had no choice but to turn east toward China. If the door is closed on you in the West, it's naturally necessary to go east. Who's the biggest player in the East? China. China has the money to buy Russia's energy. China's industrial base can absorb Russian exports. So the cheap natural gas, low-cost oil, expanded exports, project cooperation, and trade surplus China has enjoyed over the past 2 years are not because Russia genuinely wants to give China long-term benefits. They're a temporary arrangement forced by circumstances. Now, what happens if Russia wins the war? Minxin Pei's logic is, as soon as Russia wins, even if partially, it gains leverage at the negotiation table. Europe, seeking to end the war, stabilize energy markets, lower inflation, and improve security, is likely to give Russia some room. Even if sanctions aren't fully lifted, there might be structural easing. For example, some energy deals resume. Certain channels reopen. Europe lets Russia partially re-enter markets. Or they start limited cooperation. They don't need to restore everything fully, just a little opening is enough for Russia to have alternatives, so it doesn't have to rely 100% on China. As a result, the cheap deals China got from Russia over the past 3 years could shrink fast. Russia doesn't have to sell oil as cheaply, and doesn't have to sell certain key resources only to China. Europe becomes a buyer again, China is no longer the only big partner, and naturally, China's negotiating power decreases. That's the first layer, economic impact. The second layer, even trickier than economics, is the international political narrative. Minxin Pei argues that even though China emphasizes no side-taking, Western opinion generally sees China as leaning toward Russia in the war. It's not about what China says, it's about what it does. How much Russian energy has China bought? How much has trade with Russia increased? Has China provided a stable economic backing for Russia? Has China softened the effect of sanctions? The West can see all of this as practical support. If Russia wins, might Western political systems attribute the victory to China's economic backing? Could they say, Russia was able to survive to the negotiating table because China bought too much Russian energy and provided an alternative market, weakening the sanctions. If this narrative takes hold, what happens? Stricter measures against China will follow one by one. Tighter technology controls. More stringent supply chain decoupling. More systemic diplomatic containment will be on the way. It becomes a reason for the US and Europe to restrict China further. Remember, the key here isn't whether the facts perfectly match, but whether the narrative can dominate public opinion. International politics often isn't about facts winning, it's about whose story influences policy more. Based on this logic, Minxin Pei believes China could face a double loss. First, even if Russia partially returns to Europe, China's benefits from Russia decrease. Second, the West is more strongly blaming China in the wake of Russia's victory, further squeezing China's strategic space. That's the basis for his claim that, if Russia wins, China suffers the most. Does his argument make sense? His concerns have a logical foundation, and he's not making things up like some China haters. For example, Russia has long wanted to maintain its energy relationship with Europe. Its reliance on China in the past 3 years was a forced choice, while cooperation with Europe is a decades-long strategic preference. The West views China as weakening the impact of sanctions on Russia. So Professor Pei's worries have a real-world basis. But on the other hand, there are plenty of strong counterarguments. Critics say Minxin Pei's problem is he oversimplifies whether Russia can return to Europe, underestimates China's strategic resilience, and overestimates Western unity. First, China-Russia cooperation isn't temporary. Pipelines were planned over a decade ago. Energy contracts are long-term, multi-decade deals. Cross-border trade systems are structurally reorganized. Local currency settlement systems are deepening. These aren't temporary fixes. They won't collapse just because the war ends or Europe loosens a little. Second, can Russia really be accepted back into Europe? Big question mark. Europe is accelerating the energy transition. Germany is burning wood and using more coal, for instance. Political trust between Russia and Europe is shattered. Europe's security strategy has been fully updated. Even if cooperation between Russia and Europe happens in the future, its depth and scale are unlikely to return to pre-war levels. Third, China isn't Russia's only partner. It's the world's second-largest economy and a supply chain hub. It has deep connections with ASEAN, the Middle East, Africa, Latin America, Europe, and even US companies. Isolating China is unrealistic and ineffective. Fourth, in recent years, China has been pursuing diversified supply chains, expanding the domestic market, upgrading its industries, and making multilateral diplomatic arrangements. These increase resilience against external shocks. The Ukraine war's outcome is a variable, but it won't determine China's fate. Fifth, China's role as a peace broker in the war could actually pay off in the future if well maintained. Taken together, these 5 points show China's situation is much more robust than Minxin Pei's vulnerability chain suggests. So how should we view this? I think the key isn't what if Russia wins. It's how will China shape its strategy in the next few years. Professor Pei's view is more of a warning than a prophecy of disaster. He's reminding us, some gains over the past 3 years are abnormal. China should avoid being labeled a backer of Russia. China should maintain strategic ambiguity and not be dragged in. China needs to handle Europe carefully to avoid being the focal point. China should continue promoting peace talks rather than falling into Western narratives. These reminders are very valuable. But the counterarguments are strong too. China's fundamentals are solid. Cooperation with Russia is deep. China's global relationships are broad. Western policy toward China doesn't change linearly just because Russia wins. Energy, trade, and supply chains are structural and won't be easily reversed. So reality isn't a simple chain. Russia wins, China loses. The real answer depends on how China navigates and balances its strategy, deals with Western narratives, and maintains its strategic space in the coming years. It isn't about fate, it's about strategy. China, the US, and Russia once played a three-way game, but now the US doesn't really focus on Russia. China is increasingly seen as the main competitor, while Russia is just a troublemaker. Donald Trump refers to China and the US as G2 club members, while Russia is not part of it. In other words, even if Russia's victory isn't due to China's backing, the US may still use it as a pretext to further contain China. The problem is, the US now has the time and resources to curb China, and that's the real headache for China. Finally, I want to toss several questions to end the video. From the perspective of an ordinary person, is a Russian victory more of an opportunity or a risk for China? Should China maintain high-intensity cooperation with Russia or emphasize independent diplomacy? Will Russia's victory reshape the global order, or is it just part of a bigger cycle? Please leave your thoughts in the comments, and we really love seeing different perspectives in the Different Frames the World community.